The inheritance he never saw coming. The judge looked up from the papers in front of him and said the words that ended my marriage in front of a room full of strangers. He said my net worth was $28.7 million. My husband did not smile after that. His mother stood up so fast her chair screeched across the floor, and then she went pale and dropped straight into her seat like her legs had stopped working. My husband stared at me like he had never seen me before in his life. And the strangest part of all of it was this. I had never once tried to hide that money from him. I simply had not known it existed either, not until 3 weeks before that courtroom changed everything I thought I knew about the man I married. My name is Claire Bennett Holloway, and for 16 years I believed I understood exactly who I was married to. I was a stay-at-home mother in a quiet suburb outside Denver, Colorado, raising 2 kids, keeping our house running, and never once asking my husband Marcus to prove his love with anything more than his presence at the dinner table. I thought that was enough. I thought love did not need receipts. I was about to learn that some people only show you who they really are the moment they think there is something to gain, and by then, it is usually too late to undo what you have already seen. My grandfather was a man named Walter Reeves, and if you had passed him on the street you would never have guessed he had a dollar to his name. He wore the same brown coat winter after winter, drove a Buick that rattled at every red light, and once scolded my cousin for spending $4 on a coffee like it was a personal insult. Everyone in the family assumed he was comfortable, maybe a little better off than most, nothing more. I certainly never imagined he was sitting on a fortune. He never talked about money, not once in my whole life, and I would later learn that silence was not an accident. It was a test he was running on all of us without our knowledge. 3 weeks before that courtroom, I sat in a small law office in downtown Denver listening to an attorney named Diane Kessler read my grandfather's will out loud. My mother sat beside me, quiet and still. My children, Owen and Hazel, sat near the window, more interested in the view than the paperwork. Marcus had taken the afternoon off work to be there with me, which at the time felt like devotion. Diane adjusted her glasses, flipped a page, and said there were several small bequests scattered through the family, but the primary beneficiary of my grandfather's entire estate was me. I remember blinking and asking her to repeat herself, because for a second I genuinely thought I had misheard. What followed was a list I could barely process. Investment accounts. Commercial real estate. Shares in a private company my grandfather had quietly built over decades. And a family trust, established years earlier, with my name written into it as the sole controlling beneficiary. My grandfather had not simply left me an inheritance. He had left me control over something enormous, something he had built in total silence while wearing a coat with a fraying collar. My throat tightened and I asked Diane why he never told me. She looked at me with a small, knowing sadness and said that Walter believed knowing too soon changes the way people treat you. I did not understand that sentence yet. I would understand it completely within the hour. Marcus leaned toward me in his chair and asked quietly how much. I told him honestly that I did not know yet. He studied my face for a long moment, the way you study something you are trying to measure, and said I must have some idea. I told him again that I truly did not. He leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in 16 years of marriage I saw something in his expression that had never been there before. It was not happiness for me. It was not excitement or relief or love. It was calculation, plain and cold, and once I saw it, I could not unsee it. That night, lying in bed, Marcus asked me again what the attorney had said. I told him there was a trust and he asked what kind. I said I did not know yet and that we had a follow-up meeting the next week. He nodded slowly, and then he said something I should have written down and kept forever, because it told me everything I needed to know before I was ready to hear it. He said, "You are lucky." I smiled and told him he was lucky too, because he had me as his wife. He did not smile back. Instead he said we would need to talk about how we were going to handle everything, and I remember thinking he meant our future together. I was wrong about that in a way that still makes my stomach turn. A few days later, Marcus had a business trip to Chicago, and my kids came up with the idea of surprising him at his hotel. Hazel wanted to bring his favorite cheesecake. Owen wanted an excuse to see the city. I wanted to see my husband's face light up when his family showed up after a long, exhausting week away from home. We flew out on a Friday afternoon with a box of dessert and a plan to surprise him at dinner, and instead I walked into a scene that rearranged every memory I had of our marriage. Marcus was standing near the restaurant entrance, and he was not alone. A woman in a navy blazer stood close beside him with her hand resting on his arm, and he was laughing at something she had said. I froze behind a column with my children just a few steps away, and I put my hand up to keep them from moving forward. I heard the woman ask him if he was sure his wife would not fight him. Marcus laughed and said she does not have the money to fight me. My stomach dropped somewhere I could not locate. Then the woman asked about the inheritance, and Marcus glanced around the room before answering that once the divorce was filed, they would find out exactly what I had. He said he had already spoken to a lawyer. I stood frozen behind that column, listening to the man I had loved for 16 years discuss the end of our marriage like it was a business deal he was closing, and I understood in that instant that everything about the last few weeks had been a performance. I had two choices standing there with my children beside me. I could walk into that restaurant and confront him in front of a stranger, or I could stay quiet long enough to understand exactly what he was planning to do to me. I chose silence, and I want to be clear that it was not weakness. It was strategy, even though I did not fully know it yet. I took Owen and Hazel back to the airport that same night without ever letting Marcus know we had come. On the flight home, Hazel fell asleep against my shoulder while Owen stared silently out the window, and eventually he asked me why we did not surprise Dad after all. I told him gently that sometimes you learn something important before you are ready to hear it, and he nodded like he understood more than a boy his age should have to. Once the kids were asleep that night, I called Diane. She picked up on the second ring and asked if everything was all right. I told her no, and then I told her exactly what I had heard in that hotel lobby. There was a long silence on the line before she finally spoke, and what she said made my blood run cold. She told me someone had already contacted her office asking detailed questions about my grandfather's trust. I asked who, already half knowing the answer before she said it out loud. It was my husband's attorney. I sat alone in my dark kitchen that night, staring at the light spilling out from the open refrigerator, understanding that in 3 weeks that same man would stand in a courtroom having no idea what I had already learned about him. The next morning I sat across from Diane in her office while she spread documents across the conference table like she was laying out the pieces of a puzzle I had not known I was part of. Before we talk about your inheritance, she said, I need you to understand something important. If Marcus is preparing for a divorce, then anything you say about your grandfather's estate from this point forward could become ammunition in a legal strategy. I stared at her, stunned, and asked if he already knew there was money. She said he clearly knew there was something, but not how much, and that we needed to keep it that way for as long as possible. I had never once thought of my marriage in terms of legal strategy. For 16 years I thought of Marcus as the man I called when our kids had fevers, when the furnace broke in January, when my mother needed a ride to a doctor's appointment, or when I simply wanted to talk about my day over dinner. Now my own attorney was telling me to protect myself from him, and something about that instruction felt like grief. Diane slid another folder toward me, and inside was an email sent from someone representing Marcus to a financial institution, asking how the value of assets inside a family trust could be assessed during divorce proceedings. The email was dated 2 days before my grandfather's will was even read. I drove home that afternoon without calling him first, and he was already there when I walked in, sitting at the kitchen island in the gray sweater I had bought him for Christmas, laptop open in front of him. For one unguarded second, the sight of him almost cracked me open, because this was still the man who had held my hand through my father's funeral and slept beside me for 16 years. He asked how my day was, and when I said fine, he asked if I had talked to the attorney about the estate. I asked why he was so interested, and he told me it was because we were married, a sentence that would have comforted me a year earlier and now sounded like a quiet warning wrapped in familiar words. That night became the first night I locked important documents inside a safe in my grandfather's old study. It also became the first night I began replaying years of small moments I had once dismissed as ordinary curiosity. Marcus asking whether my grandfather owned commercial property. Marcus pushing me to sign refinancing paperwork without reading every page. Marcus becoming unusually attentive to our finances right around the time my grandfather's health began to decline. I had called all of it curiosity back then. Now I understood it might have been preparation, laid down brick by brick over years, waiting patiently for a moment exactly like this one. The following Monday, a process server knocked on our door just after 9 in the morning and handed me divorce papers before Marcus had even said a word to me about it. My hands trembled as I signed for them, and I stood in the doorway for almost a full minute just staring at the envelope in my hands. He had filed without a single conversation. The petition claimed my financial situation was uncertain and referenced potential undisclosed assets, which meant he was publicly accusing me of hiding money while he had privately been investigating my inheritance for weeks. I called Diane immediately, and when I asked if he could take the trust, she said not simply because he filed, but that we needed to prepare carefully and quickly. That afternoon Marcus came home early and placed a folder on our kitchen table, telling me I should sign it because it would simplify things. I asked what it would simplify, and he said the divorce, like the word barely cost him anything to say. I told him he had clearly already decided everything without me, and he shrugged and said there was no point dragging it out. Then he smiled, the exact same smile from that hotel lobby in Chicago, confident and almost amused, and told me I did not have the money to fight him. My son Owen was standing in the hallway. He had heard the whole thing, and he said, "Mom does not need money to be our mom," and for one brief second I saw something crack in his father's face before it hardened right back into place. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I sat alone in my grandfather's study exactly as he had left it, his books still lined up on the shelves and his old brass lamp still glowing beside the chair. I opened a drawer and found a handwritten note with my name on it, dated 6 months before he passed. It said that people might treat me differently once they learned what he had left me, and that their reaction would be about them, not about me. It said to protect what he had entrusted to me, but never to let money convince me I was worth more than anyone else, because my character had always been the real inheritance he cared about. I read it twice and cried, not because of the money, but because my grandfather had understood something about people that I was only now beginning to learn the hard way. Over the following days, the settlement conference approached, and Diane kept building a case brick by brick out of every document Marcus had ever pressured me to sign without explanation. There were refinancing papers from 3 years earlier, an authorization giving him broader access to accounts I barely used, and paperwork tied to a property I had signed without reading closely because I trusted him completely. None of it transferred my inheritance to him, because legally it could not, but together it painted a picture of a man who had been quietly positioning himself for a windfall long before he ever filed for divorce. Then Diane found the email that changed everything. Marcus had written to his attorney that if the trust was as large as he thought it was, they needed to move quickly, and that I would not know what I was entitled to, so they could negotiate from there. I read that message twice with my hands shaking, because it confirmed what I had suspected since Chicago. This was never really about the failure of our marriage. It was a financial negotiation disguised as heartbreak, and he believed I was too naive to ever notice the difference. Around this same time, Diane uncovered something that hurt even more than Marcus's own words. An email from his mother, Deborah, urging him not to let me walk away with everything if my grandfather had left me the properties, insisting he had a right to his share. Deborah had never once asked how I was coping with losing my grandfather. She had asked about property values instead, and reading that email was the moment I finally stopped waiting for anyone in that family to prove me wrong. The settlement conference itself was quiet and ordinary on the surface, just a small room with a long table and a framed photo of the Denver skyline on the wall, but underneath that ordinary surface my marriage was being dismantled piece by piece. Marcus arrived confident, almost cheerful, certain he still held every advantage. Diane calmly laid out document after document, and I watched his expression change in real time as the paper trail he had built to protect himself slowly became the very thing that exposed him. His attorney tried to steer the conversation back toward productivity, but the damage had already been done, and by the time we left that room, the power between us had quietly and permanently shifted. Outside on the sidewalk afterward, Marcus caught up to me in the cold November air and asked if we could talk, really talk, not like we had been talking for weeks. I told him I understood exactly what this money was showing me, that it was showing me who people really were underneath the version of themselves they presented every day. He asked if I thought I was better than him now, and I told him no, I simply thought I was finally seeing him clearly for the first time in 16 years. For one brief moment I saw the man I had actually married, tired and scared and human, and I almost felt sorry for him. Then I remembered his voice in that Chicago lobby, saying I did not have the money to fight him, and whatever sympathy I had left disappeared completely. The morning of the final hearing, I woke before my alarm and lay still, listening to the ordinary sounds of my house, the refrigerator humming downstairs, a car passing outside, Hazel's door creaking as the heat kicked on. It felt like any other morning, but I knew by the end of the day nothing about our family would ever feel ordinary again. I put on a navy suit and looked at myself in the mirror, tired but not weak, and I reminded myself of everything 16 years of marriage had quietly taught me, that some battles are not won by being louder, but by staying calm long enough for the truth to become impossible to ignore. Inside the courtroom, Marcus sat beside his attorney looking relaxed and almost cheerful, and when he spotted me he gave me that same confident smile from the hotel lobby, the one that used to make me feel safe and now only reminded me of exactly what he had said about me to a stranger. Deborah sat behind him in a cream-colored suit, composed and certain, the same way she had carried herself at the settlement conference. The judge reviewed folder after folder of trust documents, estate records, and property valuations, and when he asked Marcus directly whether he had investigated the trust before filing for divorce, Marcus admitted he had asked questions through his own attorney beforehand. The judge noted, quite plainly, that this made his earlier filing, which described my finances as uncertain, somewhat misleading. Then the judge asked Diane whether there was a verified valuation of the estate, and she handed over the final appraisal. The room went completely silent while he read it. When he finally looked up, he confirmed the verified records placed my current net worth at approximately $28.7 million. Someone behind me gasped audibly. Marcus's face changed instantly, the confidence draining out of him in real time, because he had suspected there was money, but he had never known the number, and neither had I until the week before. He turned to me and said I never told him, and I looked back at him steadily and said he never asked, because what he really wanted to know was not who I was, but what he could take from me. That was when Deborah rose from her seat behind us, said the number out loud like she could not believe it, went pale, and collapsed straight into her chair. The courtroom fell into sudden chaos, people rushing to help her, the judge calling for a recess, and I stood completely still in the middle of it, feeling not victory, but a strange and heavy sadness. This was never how I wanted any of this to unfold. When Deborah finally opened her eyes and looked at me, there was no anger left in her face at all, only shock, and maybe, for the first time, something that looked like shame. During the recess, Marcus approached me quietly and told me he had not known, that if he had known, he would have stopped himself. I told him that was exactly the problem, because he had never loved the person standing beside him, only the life he thought I might be able to provide. He had filed for divorce believing I was worth less than him, and now that he knew the truth, he wanted to know if there was still a way back to me. He had no answer for that, because there was nothing left to say that would change what he had already shown me in that hotel lobby and in every document his own attorney had filed. When the judge returned, the proceedings continued, and it became clear that my inheritance, structured carefully through a trust established long before our marriage, would not simply become his to claim. His entire strategy, built on the assumption that I was uninformed and unprotected, collapsed under the weight of the very paperwork he had helped create. When it finally ended and I walked out of that courtroom, I understood something I had not expected to learn that day. Everything I had feared losing was never really the trust, or the properties, or the $28 million. It was my children, my dignity, and the simple, quiet ability to wake up every morning without wondering whether the person beside me was silently measuring my worth in dollars. 3 months later, life became quieter, not perfect, but quieter. The divorce was finalized, Marcus moved into a small apartment across town, and we built a parenting schedule around Owen and Hazel that let them keep both of us in their lives. Hazel asked once if we would ever have Thanksgiving together again, and Owen simply stopped asking questions altogether for a while. I learned that children do not need every detail explained to them. They need consistency, and proof that the adults in their lives will keep showing up no matter what changed between the two of us. One Saturday morning, Marcus stood on my porch and told me he had started going to counseling, and that he had been thinking about what I said in that courtroom, about losing me because he believed I was worthless when he thought I was poor. He said he deserved that, and for the first time in a long time, I believed he actually meant it. Later that same week, Deborah invited me for coffee and apologized, admitting that when she heard about the inheritance, she thought only about security and money and never once about me. I told her my grandfather always said money reveals character, and she laughed sadly and said it had certainly revealed hers. With the guidance of financial advisors, I set aside enough of the inheritance to protect my children's future and maintain the properties responsibly, but I also wanted the money to mean something larger than my own bank account. I started an education fund for Owen and Hazel, and I created a small foundation supporting financial literacy programs in local communities, because I remembered exactly how little I had understood about trusts and inherited assets before all of this began, and I knew ordinary families needed that knowledge just as much as wealthy ones did. One evening months later, sitting on the back porch with my kids as the sun went down, Hazel leaned against my shoulder and asked if I was happier now. I told her honestly that I was. Owen said quietly that he thought his father seemed happier too, because he did not act angry anymore. I told him sometimes people have to lose something before they finally understand what they had. And sitting there with my children laughing beside me for the first time in months, I finally understood what my grandfather had meant in that letter. The real inheritance was never the $28.7 million. It was the lesson underneath it. Know your worth before someone else tries to define it for you, protect what has been entrusted to you, and never confuse the size of someone's bank account with the size of their character. Marcus thought he was leaving a poor woman behind. What he actually discovered was that he had been the poor one all along.